Hi guys! Today we're talking about function in interior design because that's a very important thing, and I feel like it's something that a lot of people struggle with, is finding the balance between function and how something looks. And so I want to talk about it today. This is me urging you to consider function in your space just as much as you need to consider how your space looks. Because if you're living in your space, you want it to not only look good, but also make sense for your lifestyle. You want your life to be made easier by design choices that you've made in your space. Like, if you're going to spend the time to make decisions about how things are going to be in your space, you should also consider how that is going to affect your life. So yeah, let's talk about it. I think one of the biggest things is we always feel like it's like a battle between if something is functional or if it looks nice. But I think if we can start to think about the way that something looks as another function of the space, then it makes it less of a battle between the two. The way that something looks has a functional purpose to it because it's affecting how you feel when you're in a space, which is a really important function because how we feel in a space affects a lot of other things, right? So I think when we're designing a space, we want to be considering all the functions, including, of course, how we feel and therefore how it looks. Other people's versions of a functional space is not what is necessarily your version of a functional space. That means that you don't need to have some functional design choices that were chosen because they were functional for someone else's lifestyle to be forced into your space unnecessarily. I think this is something that's done a lot in home design because there's a lot of standard things to how homes are designed. Like bedrooms have closets in them. We have closets by the front door. Our fridge is a certain size and in a certain spot in our house, or kitchen, obviously, but all those kinds of things. And well, those decisions are often functional for most people because they've been designed and they are standard because it's a very popular set of standards. Like, most people live that way, at least in North America. I guess I'm speaking of North American standards. But I think we also do that in other ways. I talked about this a little bit in my last video, but we have an idea of what a living room layout needs to be. This is what we think a living room layout is. And again, just to reiterate what I said, there's nothing wrong with this, but it's not necessarily functional for everyone. And if it's not functional for you, or if it's not the best decision for you or how you could use your space, you don't have to follow those rules. And once we start to take away what is unnecessary in a space, then we can add in other details that are actually functional for each of our own lifestyles. And by doing that, we get so much more unique interest in interior design because then we're creating new ways of what a living room could look like or what a kitchen could look like, whatever it may be. And so, like I said in my last video, functional needs creates unique visual interest because it means we're creating something new that also works for what you need in a space. And this is not to say that you need to change your living room layout if you have a living room that looks like this. I have a living room that generally looks like this. But I think that if you think about that in just an abstract way, there's a lot of things in our home that we do just because they're standard. But if you really think about it, does that actually make your life easier? Is that how you want it? Is that how you really want it? Or is that just how you feel like it should be because this is what is standard? Maybe we can think about how we could do something differently that's more functional, and then by doing that, we get a more unique design out of it. You can invent spaces. You can invent areas for your unique needs. I feel like I'm kind of repeating myself a little bit, but I just really want to get this point across that you don't have to follow the rules. Just because this is what we think a living room is or a kitchen is doesn't mean that this has to be your living room or kitchen. Things that are not really considered normal areas in a home to have you can just decide to have those areas in your home. And by leaning into the uniqueness of an area, you can make design decisions to make that a really cool, unique feature of your home. And it doesn't need to be ugly and it doesn't need to be awkward just because it's not normal. And so you feel like it's just a forgotten space or a forgotten part of the design because you don't know how to go into it. Lean into that. You can create such unique interest in your home through creating unique areas like that, and just leaning into it and making it a really interesting feature. I really am passionate about just making decisions just because that's what works for you and then making it look really cool. So now I want to talk about how to create functional workspaces. Again, to lean off of my last point, which is kind of my philosophy on functional design and just design in general, is that you don't have to have a workspace that looks like this just because this is what you think a workspace should be like. You can think about how you work and be honest with the way that you use things and be honest with your workflow and where you gravitate towards putting things down and that kind of thing. Because when we are honest with how we function and how we work in our space, then we can use that to make decisions about where we're going to store things and which things are going to be left out and which things can be put away. Because the whole point of a functional space is we want to be able to work in it with ease. We don't want to feel like there's any resistance in the space. We want to just be able to exist in it basically and feel like it supports how we naturally want to live, because we shouldn't need to change how we're living. If you're designing a space for you, make it work for how you live, not how you think it should look. And this is not to say that you can't make a few decisions that are solely for the purpose of it looking cool, but we want to make sure that if you're making decisions about something looking cool, that it's also not taking away from any function that you need that space to have. In terms of some more practical ways of making a functional workspace, I guess for me, I like to be able to see and have really easy access to all of my tools. My workspace is a drafting area, and I do model building for my architecture program. And so for me, what works is having a workspace where I can see all of my tools or easily access everything. So when I chose the tools that I was getting and which ones I wanted to have out, I made sure that when I was buying certain tools that I knew were going to be out and on display in my space, that they were kind of the cuter version or a more pleasing to look at version of those tools. And then for the things where the function of that would be affected by choosing the prettier option, I just made the decision that okay, these are the things that I can put away and hide. But then also when I was choosing where to store things, I made sure that they were all easily accessible for when I'm using them. But yeah, getting back to considering the way that you work, think about things like how big of a desk do you want? Are you the kind of person that spreads out, or are you that kind of person that it doesn't really matter and you can have a smaller desk? Do you need a big table, or do you want a tiny desk that sits in the corner of your room? And then if you're the kind of person that wants one of those things, then make a moment out of it. You can have a big desk and you might feel well, that is not the cutest thing in the world. Think about ways that you can just make that into an interesting and unique design decision in your space. There's always a way to make it look cool. And so just because you have to make a practical decision, you don't need to give up on how it's going to look. There's always a way to make it look cool. Okay, so now I want to talk about functional storage. And I kind of made some of these points when I was talking about designing functional workspace, but with the same idea for functional storage, you want to think about how you actually live in your space. Think about where you're using things and when you're using things and where you gravitate towards putting things down and where you have resistance to putting things away in your home, and use all that information to decide how and where you're going to store your items. Think about how often you use things, or if there are certain things that you can put away, and maybe they're a little harder to get, but you don't need them all the time, so it's okay. Or if there are things that you're like constantly leaving out and never putting away, like your keys, for example, make sure that when you're thinking about where you're going to store those, it's like easy and it doesn't have a lot of resistance to where you're naturally drawn to putting things. And then also, I think that it's important to not overdo the hidden storage. Like, you should have some things out in your space that are not necessarily contributing to the design, but they're not necessarily hindering from the design. And those things are the things that add personality to your space and make it look like it's actually lived in. You don't need everything to be behind a cabinet. I think that places where everything in your space is hidden and you have nothing out, they just feel very stark to me. It doesn't feel like anybody lives there, and it's not a very welcoming and warm feeling. And also, most people don't live like that. But it also depends on the person and your style and how things make you feel in your space. If you're someone who really dislikes clutter, you really like that look of having like a very clean and neat space, then yeah, you can hide things. But I also think that it has to align with your lifestyle. If you like that look, but you have too many things, so then now your space is overwhelmed by cabinets because you have so many things you need to hide, then maybe consider that you need to get rid of some of your things so that it's not overwhelmed by that functional need that you have. You don't have to sacrifice your functional needs, but you don't need to give up on the way that that is going to look in your space. And I think that there is always a way to make any functional need look cool if you strip it down to what that need really is and get rid of all your predetermined ideas about what that need should look like, and instead think about how you can make this the best thing for you in your space, but then also just leaning into it with the design and making it look really cool. Finding the balance between function and design is like a challenge that everyone is facing all the time. It's a challenge that designers are facing all the time, and it's such an interesting topic, and there's so many things I could have said about it. I'll probably make more videos about it because there's so many different directions I could have gone in with how to talk about this. But I hope that this gives you a little bit of inspiration on how to deal with your functional needs, but also I hope that this stops you from making spaces that just look pretty but are actually really impractical for your lifestyle. I think that's like the instinct when we're designing a space, is to just like only think about how it looks. I'm guilty of this for sure. I'm sure a lot of people are. But then once you start living in a space, you're like, maybe this doesn't really work out because I didn't really think about how I lived in this space. So I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching, and yeah, I'll see you in my next video. Bye!